I'm going to remarry your sister who inherited the entire fortune. Poor people like you should just disappear. Grinning, my husband blurted out to me. Next to him was my sister, leaning on him in a way that was meant to show off. Sis, it must feel miserable to have both the inheritance and your husband taken by me. Oh, taking everything from you feels so good. We're going to live happily ever after with Dad's inheritance. My sister said to me with an ecstatic expression. Considering your dad left a huge fortune. You're really stupid for renouncing the inheritance. What a dumb woman. My husband and sister mocked me, and I felt a boiling anger inside me. Could these two really be human? Their obsession with money made them appear more like monsters than humans in my eyes. Indeed, I had renounced the inheritance from my wealthy father who passed away recently. Right after that, my husband left me for my sister who received the entire inheritance. I sighed deeply and then addressed them. I see. Let's get a divorce. Oh, you're surprisingly obedient. I thought you'd cling and beg not to divorce. My husband sounded surprised, but I had no love left for him. There was no way I would say anything like that. I signed the divorce papers he brought and handed them to him. Now we can get divorced. I'm going to start a new life as a wealthy man. Thanks, sis. A divorced woman like you probably won't be able to remarry, but keep your spirits up. They burst into laughter. That's how our divorce was finalized, and 3 months passed. Then, I received an incessant amount of calls from my ex-husband. Staring at the massive call history from him, I couldn't help but let out a smile. You realized it now, huh? It's too late. My name is Jocelyn. I'm 35 years old. I married Tony, who is 3 years older than me, 10 years ago, and we lived as a working couple. We have a son who is now 8 years old. His name is Scott. Scott used to be clingy when he was younger, but recently, he has become more independent and can take care of himself. Tony had helped with parenting for about a year after Scott was born. He was so involved that he could have been called a hands-on dad. However, as Scott grew past 1 year old, Tony gradually became uncooperative and stopped helping altogether. Scott was a child who cried a lot at night, and this continued even after he turned 1. Shut up. Why does he keep crying at night? Is there something wrong with him? Tony screamed, clearly frustrated. Don't say such awful things. It's not uncommon for children to cry at night until they're about 1.5 years. Don't call your own child strange. I was furious at Tony's harsh words and retorted. Whatever. I don't find Scott cute at all anymore. I could have loved him if it weren't for the night crying, but he just keeps on crying. It's so annoying, make him stop. It's affecting my work tomorrow. Tony seemed to be struggling with Scott's night crying. His lack of cooperation in parenting seemed to stem largely from this. I tried my best to soothe Scott, rocking him in my arms or sometimes taking him for a drive. Tony always looked at me with a look of disgust as I struggled alone. Looking at you pisses me off. It's like you're trying to show off how desperately you're parenting alone. It's annoying. I sometimes fought back against Tony's verbal abuse, but the constant quarreling was a burden. So I often chose to stay silent. Even after that, I continued to handle all the housework and childcare by myself, desperately juggling everything until Scott turned 2. At which point I put him in daycare and returned to work. Despite my return to work, Tony did not help with either housework or childcare, forcing me to manage everything on my own in a whirlwind of daily activities. Even when I asked for help, he would just say, "I'm too tired," and relax on the sofa all the time. I knew I should rely on others, but I chose not to ask my parents for help. My mother had passed away when I was young, and my father was elderly. I didn't want to burden him. I do have a younger sister, but we have never gotten along well. Rather, she has always unilaterally despised me. My sister, Maggie, is 3 years younger than me, making her 32 now. Since childhood, she has been the type who is never satisfied unless she is the center of attention. She detested anything that made me, her older sister, the priority. One incident with Maggie stands out vividly in my memory. It happened on the day our father bought me a new dress because my favorite dress had become worn out from so much use. He bought me a new dress with a fresh sunflower pattern. I was overjoyed and thanked my father repeatedly, his face breaking into a smile. However, that happy moment was soon shattered by Maggie. While she had been playing alone in another room, Maggie came running over to us, screaming, "Ah! What's with that dress? Why did Dad only buy you a dress? He hasn't bought me one. That's unfair. So unfair. What are you talking about? You just got a new sweater and skirt recently." Despite my response, Maggie seemed far from convinced and began crying and clinging to our father. "Dad, buy me a dress too. Please. It's unfair that only she gets one. Buy me one too." Despite our father's attempts to calm her, Maggie continued to wail and cry. Reluctantly, he ended up buying her a dress as well. Maggie always envied me. But there was never any truth to her feeling that she was the only one treated specially. Yet, Maggie often complained about how only my sister gets everything, troubling the adults around her with her selfishness. When we were younger, adults often indulged her whims because she was the younger sibling. As we grew older and were told to be more patient, Maggie would twist logic to get her way. Moreover, she often looked down on me, boasting about being more loved by those around her. I always calmly admonished her, which only made her hate me more. Maggie grew into an adult without shedding her selfish nature, moving out as soon as she entered university. Now, she lives off gifts from various people, without a steady job. She has not married yet. I haven't been in touch with Maggie for years and plan to keep it that way. The last time I saw her was at my wedding. Maggie showed up in a white dress, so flamboyant that she might have outshone the bride. Wearing a white dress to a wedding is a well-known faux pas, which Maggie surely knew. Yet, she chose to wear it anyway. I'll never forget the look on Maggie's face as she scoffed at my wedding dress and said, "That doesn't suit you at all. By the way, your face looks swollen. Did you even go to a bridal spa or something?" Throughout the reception, she drank wine excessively, becoming visibly drunk and bothering multiple men. I haven't seen Maggie since that day. While I know how to contact her, there's no need without a specific reason. It seems she hasn't returned home at all either. There have been times when I considered divorcing Tony. However, for all his faults, he is Scott's only father. Making the decision to divorce has never been easy. Then, one day, I received a call that my father had suddenly fallen ill and was rushed to the hospital. I explained the situation to my boss and hurried to the hospital. I tried to contact Maggie as well but couldn't reach her by phone, so I sent her an email. After a while, I received a reply. "What, Dad's about to die? Well, he's old. I have a date today, so I can't go to the hospital. Let me know the place and time for the funeral, okay?" To say such a thing when it wasn't even certain he would pass away. And to prioritize a date over her own parent was unbelievable. I was stunned by Maggie's lack of common sense. While I was dealing with this, Tony also arrived at the hospital. "How's your dad's condition?" Tony seemed to have rushed over, panting heavily. "It looks very serious." "Tony, you're worried about my father, aren't you?" "Thank you." Honestly, I was surprised to see Tony so concerned about my father. While my father and Tony weren't on bad terms, they weren't particularly close either. In the end, my father passed away. Maggie didn't show up at the hospital, so Tony and I were the ones to see my father off. Dad. As I clung to my father's lifeless body and cried, Tony was crying exaggeratedly beside me. It seemed almost unnatural. Afterward, Tony helped with the funeral preparations. And I contacted Maggie about the location and date. 4 days after my father's death, we held the funeral. And Maggie showed up with a big smile on her face. "Hey, sis, long time no see. Let's talk about the inheritance quickly." She said it in such a cheerful tone that it seemed almost as if a heart emoji would pop up at the end of her sentence. Actually, my father was a wealthy man. Since our mother had passed away when we were young, we, the sisters, were the only heirs. I told Maggie calmly. "Today is Dad's funeral. Let's postpone the inheritance talk for another day." Maggie seemed dissatisfied. But I ignored her and went around greeting the people who had come to my father's funeral. On the night the funeral ended, after putting Scott to bed, I told Tony. "I've been thinking. I want to renounce my inheritance." Tony responded with an incredulous voice. "What? Hey, don't be so loud. Scott will wake up." After a lot of thought, I've decided to renounce the inheritance. Despite my rebuke, Tony became even more agitated and confronted me. "Why would you renounce it? Don't joke around. Your father had a vast fortune, right? It's stupid not to inherit it. Don't be so angry. Please, calm down. We can't have a proper conversation if you're like this." Tony's furious reaction only increased my distrust. How can I not be angry? I will never allow you to renounce the inheritance. Don't say such ridiculous things. Idiot. Seeing Tony's face turn red, a suspicion arose in me. Could it be that Tony had been after my father's inheritance from the start? The way he cried when my father passed away, was it all just an act? Were you aiming for my father's inheritance, Tony? Was all that crying when my father died just an act? Tony sneered and said mockingly. "Yeah, that's right. So what?" Well, it was more like tears of joy. I was so happy, thinking, finally, he's gone. I thought I'd become rich. Tony's confession left me feeling so angry and disappointed that everything seemed to go dark. How could he say such awful things so nonchalantly? The man in front of me seemed more like a monster than a human. "I see. But no matter what you say, I'm going to renounce the inheritance." Despite Tony shouting, "You're really a fool," my decision remained unshaken. Later, I informed Maggie of my decision to renounce the inheritance. And it was decided that she would inherit everything from our father. Once it was officially decided that Maggie would inherit everything, Tony showed no more interest in me. He barely greeted Scott and started coming home later and later. Until eventually, he stopped coming home at all. What happened to Dad? Dad is just very busy with work. You don't have to worry about anything, Scott. I reassured Scott, who was concerned. Sometime later, I received an email from Tony saying, "I have something to tell you tonight." I decided to leave Scott with a nearby friend so we could talk. I somehow felt that Scott shouldn't be present for this. As night fell, Tony returned home with someone. "Excuse us," came a voice I recognized. "Sorry for dropping in so suddenly, sis." Yes, the person Tony came home with was my sister, Maggie. The moment I saw Tony's smirking face, I had a pretty good idea of what was about to be discussed. The three of us sat around the table, and Tony started speaking with great enthusiasm. "So, I've decided to divorce Jocelyn and marry Maggie." "Oh? Is that because Maggie will inherit the entire fortune from Dad?" At my question, Tony burst out laughing. If you knew, why did you renounce the inheritance? You're really stupid. If you had just accepted the inheritance, none of this would have happened. As I remained silent, Tony began to hurl insults. On top of being foolish enough to renounce the inheritance. You don't look nearly as good as Maggie. I was surprised when I saw Maggie at your father's funeral. Not only has she maintained her beauty, but she's also become even more beautiful. That's when I thought, I have no choice but to divorce you and be with Maggie. It seems Tony made his move on Maggie. Sis, it must feel miserable to have both the inheritance and your husband taken by me. Oh, taking everything from you feels so good. We're going to live happily ever after with Dad's inheritance. Maggie said, her face glowing with ecstasy. So, I'm going to remarry Maggie, who inherited the entire fortune. Poor people like you should just disappear. Tony said, laughing loudly with Maggie. I sighed deeply and then spoke to them. I see. Tony, let's get a divorce. Oh, you're surprisingly obedient. I thought you'd cling and beg not to divorce. Tony sounded surprised, but I had no affection left for him. Why would I say anything like that? How deluded can this man be? Just so you know, I'll be taking custody of Scott. I stated, and Tony muttered as if he had forgotten. Ah. Right. Of course, that's fine. Kids are a nuisance for starting a luxurious new life with Maggie. In fact, I had forgotten about Scott until now. Oh right, I have a son. What a despicable man. It's truly a relief Scott wasn't here. The thought of Scott hearing such words sends shivers down my spine. I suppressed the urge to yell at Tony and calmly informed him. I'll be filing for compensation and child support through a lawyer later on. Huh? If you wanted money, why did you renounce the inheritance? Tony laughed mockingly. Really? You make no sense, sis. Maggie leaned on Tony, both of them scoffing. Well, I'll easily pay off a few tens of thousands as petty cash. After all, we're about to receive a huge fortune from your father. Don't forget what you just said. Now, did you bring the divorce papers? I asked, and Tony said, oh right, as he took the divorce papers out of his bag. I've filled in my part, so just sign yours quickly. Understood. I filled in my section and handed it back to Tony. Yes, now we can get divorced. Thanks, sis. But, you know, with your plain looks and being a 35-year-old divorcee, you'll probably never remarry. True that. Just as Maggie says, your life is going to be hell from here on. What a miserable old hag. Facing the two who were laughing uproariously, I said firmly. Our conversation is over, so I'm going to pick up Scott now. Could you two not come back to this house until I'm ready to leave? After saying this, I headed to my friend's house to pick up Scott. Upon seeing me, Scott ran up to me with a big smile, shouting, "Mom," and jumped into my arms. His cuteness was overwhelming, and combined with the stress from earlier, I felt tears welling up. I thanked my friend and handed her some department store sweets I had bought in advance. She seemed to sense that something significant had occurred, showing concern for me. Jocelyn, you look pale. Are you all right? Remember, you can always rely on me if you need anything. Her kindness nearly made me cry again. After thanking her repeatedly, Scott and I left her house. Walking down the night street hand in hand with Scott. He hummed a tune and joyfully swung my hand as we walked. Tears welled up in my eyes, perhaps due to the emotional upheaval. This was no time for tears. After all, I had no reason to cry. The ones who would truly suffer were not us, but those two. I decided that would be the last time I cried. From now on, Scott and I would lead a happy life together. When Scott and I returned home, Tony and Maggie were already gone. I immediately began looking for a new place to live, found a suitable apartment online, and went to the real estate agent to sign the contract. Fortunately, I found a good place within Scott's school district, which was lucky since I didn't want to change Scott's environment too much. Thus, having prepared for the move, I left the house with Scott. Later, through a lawyer, I filed for child support and compensation from Tony. I also demanded compensation from Maggie, but perhaps feeling bold from the inheritance. Both paid the demanded amount in full. I used that money to establish a foundation for our new life. And Scott and I began our new life together. Scott seemed to really like our new home and easily accepted the divorce. "As long as I have Mom, I'm okay," he said, smiling at me. Tony had only cared for Scott until he was 1, and after that, they had minimal interaction. Perhaps, after I declared my renunciation of the inheritance, Tony's attitude became even more indifferent, so for Scott, having a father might have been the same as not. I vowed to make Scott happier than ever before. Fortunately, I had my job and the compensation and child support from Tony and Maggie, so we had little to worry about financially. We lived a peaceful and joyful life. 3 months after the divorce, Tony suddenly called. However, I was at work and had my phone in my bag, not noticing his call. After work, when I checked my phone, I saw dozens of missed calls from Tony. Listening to the voicemails, I heard Tony's desperate voice. "Call back urgently." I snorted and muttered, finally noticed, "Huh?" Without calling back, I put my phone back in my bag and headed home. While on the train, Tony's continuous calls became so annoying that I turned off my phone. After picking up Scott from after-school care and returning home, we had dinner together. By then, I had completely forgotten about Tony's calls. While eating, Scott excitedly told me about his day at school. Listening to him was my greatest joy. After cleaning up from dinner, I remembered I had turned off my phone. When I turned it back on, Tony immediately called. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity about their current situation led me to answer. Fortunately, Scott was doing homework in another room, so he wouldn't hear the conversation. "Hello? Hey. I've been calling you so many times. I left a message on your voicemail, why didn't you answer until now?" Tony was furious, shouting at a volume that threatened to break the speaker. "Calm down, please. Let's talk more calmly. What's this all about?" Though I had an idea, I feigned ignorance and asked. "You tricked us, didn't you? You knew about the massive debt Dad had, right?" As Tony said exactly what I expected, I couldn't help but let out a smile. "Why are you laughing?" "So you did know, didn't you? That's why you renounced the inheritance, right?" Indeed, my father had more debt than assets due to falling victim to an investment scam involving an apartment complex. He had been approached by a longtime friend and had entered the deal without suspicion. Inheriting my father's estate meant inheriting his debt as well. That's why I renounced the inheritance. Yes, that's right. I knew about Dad's debt. But saying I tricked you sounds so harsh, doesn't it? So, you did know. You tricked us. You never said a word about the debt to me or Maggie. Tony was raging as if his veins might burst. I tried to explain about the debt when I told you I was renouncing the inheritance. But you just shouted me down and wouldn't listen. I remained calm, in stark contrast to Tony. Don't make it sound like it's my fault. It's entirely your fault though. Tony continued to rant, but then he tried to sound triumphant. But, you know, things aren't going to go as you planned. You wanted to make us suffer, but we'll renounce the inheritance too. Good thing we caught on early. Huh? Confused by Tony's grand misunderstanding, I inadvertently let out a dumbfounded response. Huh isn't the answer. We're saying we'll renounce the inheritance too. That's not possible. Huh? Now it was Tony's turn to sound bewildered. You can't. It's been 3 months since the inheritance. So renunciation isn't an option anymore. Plus, you've already touched the inheritance. So you couldn't renounce it even if the 3 months hadn't passed. No, that can't be true. Tony's voice trembled. It's true. You can easily find this out if you look it up. Tell Maggie too. Renunciation is no longer an option. No. If we can't renounce the inheritance, what will happen to us? We'll be drowned in debt. Yes, that seems likely. But that's no longer my concern. So, I'm hanging up now. I said and ended the call. As expected. Tony and Maggie ended up saddled with a massive debt and faced a difficult life making payments. 3 months had passed. On this holiday, Scott and I spent the morning making a generous batch of pancakes with various toppings for a slightly extravagant breakfast. Then, my phone rang. The caller was Maggie. I considered ignoring it but figured she'd probably just keep calling, so I decided to answer. However, answering now would mean Scott could overhear the conversation. To prevent this, I told Scott, Mommy needs to take a call. Keep eating, okay? I moved to another room before answering. Sis, please help me. Maggie blurted out as soon as I answered. Even though she said that, there was no way I was going to help Maggie. However, I decided to first ask about the situation. What happened? Tony is awful. He's trying to escape by himself. He's trying to divorce me even though I said I didn't want to. He insists on divorcing me no matter what. Isn't he the worst? According to Maggie, it seems she and Tony are currently undergoing divorce mediation. Tony is apparently attempting to escape from the debt by divorcing Maggie, which was incurred due to inheriting the estate. It's terrible, right? I never thought Tony could be this kind of person. Just abandoning me so easily. Well, he openly said he married you for the inheritance from the start. So we knew he was a terrible person. Didn't you marry him just to look down on me? You're getting what you deserve. As I calmly stated, Maggie screamed back in tears. What kind of way is that to talk? You've always been like this. Always scolding me with your righteous arguments since we were kids. You've always looked at me with such cold eyes. I hate you. The feeling is mutual. I hate you too. Whether you're going through divorce mediation or drowning in debt, it has nothing to do with me. So I'm hanging up now. Maggie, in a panic, shouted. Wait. I lied, I'm sorry for saying I hate you. We're sisters, after all. Please help me. So, give me back the compensation. Please. What? Give back the compensation? There's no way I'm going to do that. There's nothing I can do for you. I responded, exasperated. That's not true. You can give me money, right? Please, $30,000. No, even $20,000 is fine. Just give me some money. I refuse. Why don't you ask Tony? Goodbye. Saying that, I ended the call. Later, I found out that the inheritance included stocks, which had crashed, increasing the net debt even more. Maggie kept calling me, so I set her number to be blocked. Months later, Scott and I were still leading a peaceful life, having completely forgotten about Maggie and Tony. Suddenly, curiosity about what happened to them led me to hire a detective agency to investigate. The investigation revealed that Maggie and Tony had finalized their divorce. After the divorce, Maggie was juggling night and day jobs to make ends meet and repay the debt. However, in the nightlife scene, even though she was beautiful, her age made it difficult to attract clients, causing her great distress. Men who used to support her during her single days all left her upon learning of her massive debt. One of the men, feeling threatened, confessed to his wife about his affair with Maggie. Most of Maggie's supporters were older, married men. The wife, upon learning of her husband's infidelity, sued Maggie for compensation, further inflating her debt. An acquaintance happened to see Maggie one night, dressed in a cheap dress, desperately trying to attract clients. "Hey, mister, won't you come in for a drink?" she pleaded to every man. But worn out from stress, no one paid her any attention. Eventually, one salaryman snapped at her, "Hag, you're too persistent." The man was soon approached by a younger, more attractive woman and quickly entered a bar with her. Maggie watched and broke down crying. Hearing this, I felt no sympathy for Maggie. She brought it upon herself. As for Tony, after divorcing Maggie, he got involved with another bad woman and ended up saddled with even more debt, working tirelessly to repay it. He was eventually fired for violating his company's policy against moonlighting. Now considering bankruptcy, I smirked at the fitting end for such a despicable man. In contrast, Scott and I continue to live peacefully. We've even got a dog now, becoming a happy family of 3. Work is going well too, and I've recently been promoted. Life is good, both at work and home, allowing me to enjoy happy days.